Okay, sort of finish up on the South Asia. Largely focusing on India simply because India is the big player in the region globally, and India right now is very much positioning itself to be the global counterpart to China, which actually makes a certain amount of sense. Um, so if you're looking at India, uh, this part of the world in general, you've got very dense populations. Bangladesh, I believe, is the second or third most densely populated country in the world, probably after parts of Indonesia. And so what you've got when you're looking at India is you've got a huge population. Unlike China, we're sort of jumping ahead of ourselves, but China by the 1950s, because of their political and other issues, basically is in a situation where they have to start instituting population control because otherwise they're going to eat themselves out of a country. And so they institute what becomes usually called the one-child rule, which basically usually almost essentially forces people to have one kid. So if you remember our demographics from the start of the semester, what that means is China basically at a governmental level and at a national level tries to reduce its population size. There's a huge amount of discussion over the 30, 40 years this was in play in terms of whether it was a good idea or a bad idea. At a pragmatic level, they probably didn't have a lot of choice. But the end result was it was successful. So they not only stopped population growth in China, but they actually sort of reversed it. Now, one of the ironies that you get into is the realization in the last, say, 20 or 30 years that population growth is usually tied to economic aspirations. If a country or region ends up in a situation where now people have access to more resources, and probably even more importantly, they have a perception that their kids can live a better world than they live if they access these resources, then what you usually start to get is the population starts to shrink because people, rather pragmatically realize, well, if I have a lot of kids, then I can't give them as much. If I've only got one or two kids, then I can give them more. And there's actually more to give them. Traditionally, what you got was societies would have a lot of children because you have to remember in most societies, there's no social welfare system. This is even true of, a lot of the world today. There is certainly none in India. And so, when you get old, there is no government support. There's no Medicare or Medicaid, Social Security, or anything like that. And there's no retirement, pension when you leave a company. You're just tossed. And so one of the main logics for having a lot of kids was when you got old, those children would take care of you. They were your social welfare system, was your network of younger relatives. And so what you find in parts of the world where that's still the case, that you need relatives to basically survive, is that's one of the major driving forces for having large families. And that's certainly still true in India. So what you get in India is, on one hand, they realize their population has completely outstripped their ability to provide them with resources, specifically water, which is the huge problem in India. But the reality is that the society as a whole can't afford to support the population, especially the older part of the population. And so what you get is people still demand large families because that's how you survive. That's how the group survives, and that's how especially older members of the family survive. China, by the 1960s, 1970s, that's starting to change. China becomes a totally socialized state. To a certain extent, the government provides welfare for old folks. And at that point, then all of a sudden, you don't need to have a lot of kids. And, the government doesn't want you to have a lot of kids, but also you don't need to have a lot of kids. When China opens up and becomes more sort of economically divergent or whatever in the 1980s, very quickly, and a huge jump in the population by say 2000 is actually basically middle class. And so there's a huge jump into basically the level of people that have the resources that they can have a comfortable life, and most importantly, can have that for their children, and they can also then have that comfortable life when they get old. And so what happens is, even though originally the government was instituting basically population control, by the 1990s, 2000, people weren't interested in a lot of kids anyways. And so, the government quits having to mandate it pretty much because no one's doing it. Now, what the government hadn't planned on is that by the early 2000 period, as the population actually starts to drop significantly in China, just because people decide they don't want to have a lot of kids, they want to have one or two kids and provide them with more, and that way the kid can support them when they get old, and the government will. And so what you get in China is you very quickly, the whole thing sort of escalates out of what the government intended. The government intended the population to sort of level off. But the population in China is one of the most rapidly dropping populations in the world. it's very quickly starting to look like Korea, Japan, and parts of Europe, and to a certain extent the United States, where folks that have anything in the way of resources aren't having kids at all. And so China's ironically in the situation that as of 2 years ago, given the fact that just 10 years ago, the one-child rule was still in place. 2 years ago, the Chinese government actually started to do a huge amount of advertising, provide benefits to people that have more than one kid. So China's in a situation where the population is shrinking. And most importantly, if you remember when we're talking about demographics, the working level population, basically younger folks, is really rapidly shrinking. And it's become a huge concern in China. So ironically, they've gone from too many people, how do we control, to not enough people, how do we expand it, in literally 10 years. India hasn't had because they don't have effective child support or child growth, demographic patterns. And so the population in India, I believe, as of this year and next year, I don't know that anyone's keeping track with COVID, but I believe the population in India has already surpassed that of China. If not, it's going to very, very quickly. And so what you get is, and unlike China, there isn't any effective, population control policy in place. And for most of these groups, especially your Hindu populations, it's not acceptable from a series of, their interpretations of religion, for example. So this is creating a huge amount of problems in India. They've got a population that's pretty much escalating out of control. And of course, what that also means is even though your lifestyle has the potential of getting better, it doesn't have the same potential it does in China, because you've got this constantly increasing, number of people all competing for the same sort of basic level of resources. And if you notice when you watch those new videos I post on India, you have to remember, for the vast majority of the population, they're making about $2 or $3 a day. If you want to put context, they're making about $10 a week, which is a hell of a lot less than China. And it's not the type of, resource, wage that's going to allow people to start controlling their population growth. So India is basically, in many ways, sort of what China was in the 1980s, 1990s, a huge population, a very poor population, and a population which is desperate for jobs, which means that India in many ways is starting to become the production base that China was, 20 years ago. So you find a lot of your industries, I think I mentioned before, moving to India. Now, the problem in India is, unlike some other parts of the world, is Indian society has always been very much defined by its elites. And that's that wedding that you'll see in the video. You have a very small group of people that have always had enormous amounts of power in India. Now, when the British come in, they don't really change that very much. They just literally add the British to the Indian wealth. Now, when the British leave, then basically this educated, very wealthy, very powerful elite stays in power. And that's the situation you've got now in India. Its closest parallel would be what you see to a certain extent in the Philippines, or a large part of Southeast Asia, but also, for example, in Latin America, where you've got the same type of situation, very, very, very small, very powerful institutionalized elites that have no interest in sharing their resources to the larger population. So on one hand, the wealthy in India are about as wealthy as you're going to see anywhere in the world. But the poor in India are some of the poorest you're going to see anywhere else in the world. And the thing that's key is there's such a huge proportion of the population that's stunningly poor. And so in that situation, what you get is it's a very complex society. To a certain extent, that video sort of show a little bit of that. But India is sort of a huge mystery to the West. And I'm not really sure why. Just, again, I think for especially the United States, any place outside of our immediate purview is sort of not of interest. But it's, there's, among other things, Mumbai is the world's largest, computer coding place in the world. If you're involved in coding, I know when we were doing coding, you contract to guys in Mumbai to actually write the code. And they did that for almost everyone in the world. They are the computer center of the planet. And that's, and that makes them hugely powerful. Not too far away, actually, in Mumbai, you also have Bollywood, which is usually called Bollywood. India is the largest single producer of shows, sitcoms, soap operas, movies, you name it. I think roughly 60% of the world's video productions are done in India, in Mumbai and Bollywood. And so a huge proportion of the world's population watches Indian video, Indian TV, not, American or Chinese or whatever. And this is something that's entirely homegrown. So what you get in when you look at this particular area is it's a very complex country. It's got some huge successes. It's got some huge amounts of revenue coming in. but somehow that just gets, coalesced into a very small part of the population. Fundamentalism I talked about before. One of the interesting things about Hindu fundamentalism is that on one hand, it's supposed to be religion-based. So it's based on whether you believe the Hindu faith. Having said that, it also in most cases is actually very, very closely tied to ethnicity. And there's a classic example, one of the guys I worked with over the years was actually his dissertation was looking at the fact that Hare Krishna, which is a Hindu-based system that you find in Europe and the United States, if those folks, who are still, I think they still have a temple here in New Manu somewhere, if those folks go to India, even though they're pretty fundamentalist Hindu, they're not allowed into Hindu temples because they're not part of the caste system, and so therefore they would pollute the temple. So even though on the religious level they're entirely acceptable, in the social ethnic aspect of the society, they're not acceptable. And so as he pointed out, in fact, what he was studying was the fact that you find Hare Krishna temples in India right next to the Hindu temples, because folks that are practicing Hare Krishna members generally have to go to those temples. They're not allowed into traditional Hindu temples. And so what you get when you look at this region is just a tremendous amount of complexity and conflict. If you want to Google this, the ongoing civil war in Sri Lanka, which has sort of quieted down a little bit, the enormous conflicts that you have in Pakistan, especially Pakistan, very complex relation between Pakistan and Afghanistan. If you remember, that's where Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan, and that has to do with Muslim fundamentalists, not with the government per se, though maybe we're not sure. But it's a very complex region. It doesn't lend itself to predictability, and it doesn't really lend itself to huge amounts of generalization. This makes it radically different than China, where you do have a tremendous amount of consistency in terms of how the government operates and how the society operates. And that's not the same. That's certainly not true in South Asia. It's a tremendously complicated region, which most folks really don't understand very well.